chapter 4. And as we began this study, we mentioned that 2 Timothy basically is the final word of Paul. We generally attach some significance to a person's last words. And I don't know of anybody in the world that you would attach more significance to his last words than the inspired Apostle Paul. And so when you get to chapter 4, you really are to his last final recorded words that we have. And it really climaxes here in about verses 6 through 8. But we're in verses 1 through 5. I want to read that from the American Standard. I charge you in the sight of God and of Christ Jesus, who shall judge the living and the dead, and by his appearing in his kingdom, preach the word. Be urgent in season, out of season, reprove, rebuke, exhort with all long suffering and teaching. For the time will come when they will not endure the sound doctrine, but having itching ears will heap to themselves teachers after their own lusts, and will turn away their ears from the truth and turn aside unto fables. But you be sober in all things, suffer hardship, do the work of an evangelist, fulfill your ministry. So we began this a little bit last week. It begins with a charge. A charge is, of course, a command to be obeyed, and it is witnessed, he says, by God and Christ Jesus. And so we always need to remember, of course, that deity observes everything that goes on in this world. There is no place that we can hide or do anything in secret. Jonah found that out. People have been figuring that out the hard way for thousands of years. But notice it is Christ who will judge the living and the dead. And so we talked about, of course, ultimate judgment. The authority is God's authority, but he has designated his Son, Acts 17:31, 2 Corinthians 5:10, as the one who will judge all men because of the fact that he became a man. So he has that right. He's been qualified to do so. When he says the living and the dead, of course, it just means when Christ comes again, there's going to be people that are alive. And then there's going to be obviously all the millions or billions that have gone before that will be raised to stand before him. And as I think we ended last week and mentioned, of course, the judgment is not a day of the determination of our fate. It will be for those that are alive. They won't know. But for anybody that's died, they already know where they're going to spend eternity. I know that from Luke chapter 16. Because when the rich man and Lazarus died, they went into the Hadean realm, the realm of the unseen, the realm where the dead await. And one was in paradise, the bosom of Abraham, and one was in Tartarus, or that place of punishment, and it was separated by a great gulf. There was no change in one's destiny upon death. And so they knew what their fate was, but the judgment day is more of a day of pronouncements or sentencing. We likened it last week to, our modern day judicial system. You get convicted by a jury, you don't get sentenced that day, right? You go back to the sentencing hearing. And it's really more of a day of the vindication of God's justice and righteousness in his name. And so we'll all stand before him. Now this expression, by his appearing in his kingdom, is a little difficult. And there's probably several ideas on that. Maybe it's to just a way to accentuate a solemn promise or oath. One writer's kind of paraphrased it this way: by virtue of the certainty of his appearing and his reign, knowing that he's coming back and knowing that he reigns. Yes.
You were talking about when we read about the rich man, Hades, and paradise, and then at the on the last day, the dead in Christ shall rise first. How do you harmonize those two? In other words, if you die and you go to paradise or Hades, Then how do you rise from the grave?
Well, you'll be reunited with, you'll have a resurrected body. 1 Corinthians 15 talks a lot about the resurrected body. We'll have a body such that, now it won't be fleshly, but it's a body, it's described as a body, and it will be a body that we recognize each other. Of course, they recognize each other in the Hadean realm. Lazarus and the rich man knew who each other were. They knew who Abraham was. But yeah, it's just a simple, everyone will rise that has died before in a resurrected body. Jesus said in John 5:28-29, marvel not at this. The hour is coming when all will hear his voice, will rise from the graves, the good unto the resurrection of righteousness or something, and the bad unto the resurrection of damnation. So everybody will rise. The 1 Corinthians 15 says those that are alive will be changed in the twinkling of an eye, so they'll be changed. But the Bible's clear that we all still have to stand before the judgment seat. There's some other passages too that we kind of pull together. Christ calls the good part of the Hadean realm paradise when he's on the cross. Remember, he tells the thief, I will be with you in paradise. But Christ wasn't going to be suffering in the Hadean realm. He was perfect. He died sinless. You'll recall that episode where Christ cast out the demons and they had to go into the swine. And you recall in one of those accounts, I don't remember which book, one of you might, in one of the gospel accounts they said, please don't send us where? We don't want to go back where? Into the abyss. They didn't want to go back into the abyss. The abyss is generally, I think, by most commentators, and I agree with this, that the abyss is the same thing as, the bad part of the Hadean realm. In other words, most likely, demons were the departed spirit, the spirits of the departed wicked dead. And so, during the time of Christ, those who had died that were evil were allowed to come back, some of them, and inhabit people's bodies. You will notice that one of those guys, or a couple of those that he cast the demons out of, where did they seem to like to hang out? Where did they like to hang out? Tombs. Some have speculated that they were probably hanging out in the same graveyard where their bodies were. And so the bottom line is they didn't want to go back to, Peter calls it Tartarus. That's the only book in the Bible that uses that particular Greek word. It's translated hell in King James. That word, English word hell, can be translated Gehenna. It's translated from three words: Gehenna, Hades, or Tartarus. Tartarus being the only time that it's used there. So generally, we associate that with the unseen realm, because remember, who else is in punishment in the Hadean realm, according to 2 Peter? Who was he talking about there? Yeah, the angels that had been cast down from their first estate. So they're also there in chains, reserved unto what? Reserved unto judgment. So you generally have to take all those verses, and that's generally what I think most people derive from those, and I would agree. But yeah, we'll have to be all, there will be a resurrection. There is going to be a bodily resurrection of some sort. Now, I don't know what it's going to look like, but 1 Corinthians 15 spends quite a bit of time discussing the resurrected body. It's different from the one that was planted, though. Remember, he talks about the difference in the seed and what comes from it. But anyway, good question. But by his appearing in his kingdom, by virtue of the certainty that he's coming again and that he reigns, Timothy, you're to do what? Preach the word. That term appearing, by the way, is that word epiphania, or epiphania, from which we get our word what? Epiphany. And it literally means a shining or a visible appearance. The point being that when Christ comes again, it will not be in secret. Sometimes, some religious groups talk about the rapture and secret comings and things of that nature. Those two angels, those two messengers of God told the apostles as they were standing there with their mouths open, gawking into heaven as Christ went up from them, they stood by and said, "Don't worry, this same Christ whom you see going into heaven will do what? Come how, though? In like manner." Yeah, just the same way. In fact, if you go over to Revelation chapter 1, I think he says something similar. Notice verse 7 of Revelation chapter 1. "Behold, he is coming with clouds, and what?
Every eye.
Every eye will see him, even they who pierced him. And all the tribes of the earth will mourn because of him." And so, his coming is it's not going to be a secret. In fact, Paul in the Thessalonian letter said he would come again in flaming fire, taking vengeance on them that know not God and obey not the gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ. This word for preach, caruso, is to proclaim a message publicly. And there is in the tense that it is in the Greek, there's a sense of urgency in there. And what is he to preach, by the way? Yeah, the Word. Gospel. Not philosophy, human speculation, funny anecdotes, all that kind of thing. Current events. Preach the Word. And I like this phrase. Be ready in season and out of season. What does that mean? Be ready in season and out of season.
All the time.
Yeah. All the time, no matter what the circumstances are. You know, sometimes it's convenient, sometimes it's not. Sometimes people want to listen to you. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes they're favorable to it. Sometimes they're not. Doesn't matter. Keep preaching. And then he kind of subdivides the preaching into several categories here. Reprove, rebuke, exhort. The New King James says convince, rebuke, exhort. That word for reprove or convict obviously conveys the idea of correcting one who is wrong. But now rebuke's a little bit stronger, right? You rebuke someone, you've got some strong disapproval or censure for their behavior, what they believe. But exhort, of course, being a positive word. I've heard several preachers make this point over the years. Reprove, convict. It really has more to do with correction. I don't know that that's necessarily negative, but overall, I've heard preachers make the point that, you know, just looking at it in the English, reprove, rebuke, exhort, it appears that there's about 2/3 of the time you need to be telling people like it is and what they need to be doing and where they need to change, whereas about maybe 1/3 of the time is a time for encouragement. I don't know if that's exactly what he meant there, but it's an interesting observation. But exhort obviously means to encourage, build up, encourage. With what? All what? Yeah, long-suffering or patience. You're not going to be short-tempered. You're not going to be impatient with people. And again, that's that word, long-suffering in the New King James or King James. That's what we think of as patience. Bearing long with someone. That's not the word that we normally see. When we see patience in those versions, that generally is better translated like it is in the modern versions as perseverance or endurance. But this is that word for patience, long-suffering. And what? Doctrine or teaching. And when you say that word doctrine or teaching, that's referring to the message taught. The message. So you're going to do so with all patience, doctrine, and then there's a for. What does a for mean? I see the English word for. Well, there's a reason, right? For the time will come when they will not endure sound or healthy or healthful doctrine or teaching. What does it mean they will not endure it?
So just wait.
Yeah, I mean, they're just not going to want to hear it anymore. They won't tolerate gospel preaching any longer. They're not going to yield to the rigorous demands of truth. And he's talking about who here? Really? Not just men in general, not just the world in general. They're always going to be that way. But he's talking about people in the church. They're not always going to, unfortunately, they're not always going to endure. They're not going to always listen to sound doctrine. They're going to want something else. And it's interesting what it is they want. But he says they will not endure sound or healthy teaching, but according to their own lust or desires. They've got some personal desires, and here's what they want. They have itching ears. Itching ears. That word for itching means to scratch or tickle. There's a passage in the philosopher Seneca's writings that says, "Why do you tickle my ears? Why do you entertain me?" The New American Standard has a good translation of this verse, wanting to have their ears tickled. And so this is exactly what people want. They want entertainment in place of substance. It could also indicate there that they want some relief from the itching of sound doctrine, you know. Man, that sound doctrine makes me itchy, makes me uncomfortable. I don't like it. Yeah?
You reckon he's talking about the Catholic Church getting started?
Do what?
I think he's talking about the Catholic Church coming on.
Well, some of this, yeah, in this context, yeah, but I think he's talking about, I mean, you could apply this to any generation. I mean, you look around us today and how many people want their ears tickled rather than sound doctrine.
But wasn't the Catholic Church sort of the first denomination type bunch?
Well, obviously, when we talk about the falling away, that's what we're talking about, sure. And it's interesting, I think you're right in the sense here that when you go back to chapter, what was it? Was it chapter 1 or 2? When he talked about, I guess it was chapter 2, and he said, basically these things that he was talking about, no, it's chapter 3. If you go back into chapter 3 and he talks about the last days, but from the context we could see that all those things that he was talking about, all those characteristics of people were actually already going on in Timothy's day, right? I mean, those things were already happening. See, sometimes, and the point I was making was when we talked about what is the last days from Acts chapter 2 and Joel chapter 2 and Isaiah 2, you know, the last days is just the Christian dispensation. It's not some future premillennial deal, you know. And you could tell from the context that these things were already going on. Verse 6. Well, verse 5. From such people turn away. He tells Timothy, look, this stuff's already going on. You turn away from these people. You go over here to chapter 4, and I think you made a good point. He says, what? Verse 3. For what? The time will come. The time will come. So I think you make a good point there. There's a difference in 3 and 4. 3, these things are already happening. 4, he says, the time will come. And so, yeah, you could probably, whereas chapter 3 are general conditions that prevail throughout the Christian dispensation, right here we're probably talking about something that is more analogous to the apostasy that's presented, you know, in Thessalonians and some other letters. Yeah, so I think you're right about that. But nevertheless, it still has some, it has some application for us as well. They will heap up, it says they will heap up. What does heap up mean? Yeah, pile up, accumulate. Teachers that will preach according to their own personal desires. As one writer put it, it's the gospel of self-centeredness. You know, what do I want? And isn't that what most religious groups ask today? You know, we got to figure out, well, what does the community want? They go out, they go out and take surveys. What does everybody want in church? Whatever they want, that's what we'll do. And notice verse 4, they will turn their ears away from what? The truth. That is the objective body of teaching from God. When it says they will turn their ears away, that just means they'll turn their interest and attention away from it. They don't want to hear it anymore. They don't want to listen to it. And they're going to turn to what? Yeah, fables or myths. Myths might even be a better translation. That's the Greek word mythos, from which we get our word myths. But same thing, fables, myths. But you do what? Yeah, some translations say be sober. The New King James says you be watchful in all things. And that Greek word, nepho, sober, means to pursue a steady course in watchfulness. You got to be vigilant. You got to be alert. You got to be spiritually awake. Timothy. And if you are vigilant, what's going to come more than likely? Hardship. You be watchful in all things, then you're going to have to do what? Endure afflictions. Persecution is going to come. You're going to suffer hardship. But now here's an interesting phrase. Do the work. Work of an evangelist. A preacher who's doing things right is working. That Greek word ergon means vigorous, hard activity. It's used frequently, Matthew 21 and other places in the Bible, context of agricultural labor. Did people that worked in agriculture during that day, did they work hard, you reckon? I realize today, you might sit in an air-conditioned tractor and watch cable TV and turn your GPS, laser-guided GPS on, and it'll turn this heat down. Some of you were a fan. All right, you get some relief from that. And maybe that's not as hard as it used to be. Doesn't mean it's not hard to make a living at it. But these people, when they were in the field, they were working. And some of you grew up working in the fields. That's the word used here for the evangelist. So preachers, evangelists work hard, should be working hard. And of course, here's the thing. Sometimes we expect them to do a lot of things that really is just a part of everyday Christian service, you know, visiting the sick, all that kind of thing, the elderly. But what's his number one job? Preach the Word. That's his number one job, is to labor in the Word. Now, that's not to say you shouldn't do those other things. There is certainly we all understand too that he may have more opportunities for that. Right? The rest of us are in full-time secular work. But you know, it's interesting in the first century, Paul, who provided for Paul's sustenance? Yeah, Paul did. Paul provided for himself. Now, he did let the Philippian church contribute to his work. But that was the only one that he would allow, because he knew they wouldn't, wouldn't be an ego thing for them. For instance, he knew that if he let the Corinthians do that, they say, well, look what we've done, Paul, or he's bumming off us or whatever. He wouldn't allow that kind of thing. So he's actually making tents, supporting himself. But his primary obligation for Timothy, the primary obligation for any evangelist is to preach and labor in the word. Remember what the apostles said when you go back to Acts, is it chapter 6 or 7, when they appointed those men to take care of the Grecian widows that were being neglected? What did they say? It's not appropriate for us to do what? To be serving tables and not be doing what? Leave the word, the teaching and preaching. That's our job. And that's not appropriate for us to be doing all these other things. So, and I realize that, there's some balance to that. These young guys are going to end up preaching somewhere where there's 60 or 70 people, and you're going to be the secretary and the preacher and everything else. The guy that takes care of the sound and whatever. I understand. But ideally their job is to preach. And so then by doing that, he will do what? He will fulfill his ministry, right? Complete it, accomplish it. That word for ministry, diakonia, his service, that was Timothy's service to the Lord. He had devoted his life to preaching the gospel. Well, now we kind of hit the climax of this book right here, verses 6 through 8. And it really is a touching and tender passage. Paul says, "For I am already being poured out," the New King James says, "as a drink offering." That is a literal, perfect translation of that term. I am already being poured out as a drink offering. And the time of my departure is at hand. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. Finally, there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will give to me on that day. And not to me only, but also to all who have loved his appearing. So he encourages Timothy to fulfill his work, keep on going, keep preaching. But Paul says, look, the time is just about out for me. My departure is at hand. I am already being offered, the American Standard says, but as I said, literally in the Greek here, he says, I am already being poured out as a drink offering. What's he talking about? Being poured out as a drink offering. What's he comparing himself to? Yeah, if you go back and read Leviticus, you will notice that many of the sacrifices that were made when they slaughtered and sacrificed the animals, grain offerings were accompanied with a drink offering. That is, some sort of wine that was poured out at the altar as a part of that whole process and procedure. And Paul likens himself to that drink offering of the Old Testament. And he says, I'm already being poured out as a drink offering. So in using this present tense here, he may be emphasizing the certainty of it. Or he could be saying, look, I'm at the beginning. It's kind of the beginning of the end. I mean, this is the last imprisonment for me. This is not going to end well when this whole procedure runs its course. And it's going to culminate in my death. There's also the passive voice that's used here, indicating that that he's the victim. He's the one being offered. That word for departure, this is kind of interesting. That word for departure is analusis in the Greek, which means to loose up. And so that would indicate what? What does that give you an idea of when it says to loose up? What's going to happen when he dies?
Hanging. Sounds like a hanging to me.
No, it has nothing to do with physical. What happens when he dies? What's going to happen to his spirit? Yeah, his spirit will fly, take its flight upward, he says, to be with the Lord. And you can compare that to the word kataluo, to loose down, in 2 Corinthians 5:1, which has to do with the disintegration of the human body. Turn over to 1 Corinthians 5. Excuse me. 2 Corinthians 5. For we know that if our earthly house, this tent, is destroyed, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. That word for destroyed is katalua, means to loose down. The body is going to be taken down like a tent. Okay? But Paul says, while his body's being taken down like a tent, my spirit's going to be loosed up. I'll fly upward to be with Christ. And he says here that the time of his departure is at hand. Obviously, it's near, imminent. But he then goes on to say what? Look at his confidence in his death. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. Well, it's interesting. We talked about this going back to 1 Timothy chapter 1 and chapter 6. There's some discussion in commentators about this terminology for fight, whether it refers to warfare or whether it refers to an athletic event. And I don't know that it matters a whole lot, but it could be an allusion to the Olympic Games. And we'll look at this whole context in just a moment, and I think that might be right as opposed to warfare. But we've got the perfect tense there where it says, I have fought, literally, the battle's over. And of course it's the good fight. It's not a carnal fight, it's a spiritual fight. It's not like Islam or something that's engaged in carnal fighting. But this course, that word definitely has to do with a racetrack. And so he says, I finished this race. You know, there's no more grueling training and all that for me. I've done all that. I'm through straining for the prize. I've kept the faith. Now again, there's some debate about what does he mean by the faith. Is that his faith, his trustworthiness, his consistency? I've kept my word, my part of the deal. Or is he talking about that he's preserved the integrity of the gospel as a preacher? I suspect for Paul, both of those things are true. And then he says, finally, there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness. Now that crown is the Stephanos, the victor's crown, not the diadema, one who reigns as a king. And notice it's going to come from the righteous judge. Remember in Genesis 18:25 when Abraham was standing there literally talking to the second member of the Godhead while those two angels went on into Sodom and was bargaining over Sodom and Gomorrah. He said, will not the judge of all the earth do what? Will not the judge of all the earth do what? Right. He'll do right. He is the righteous judge. He always does right. And who's the judge? Well, it's obviously Christ, because look at the context at the end of verse 8. Not to me only, but also to all who've loved his what? Appearing. So it's obviously referring to Christ as the righteous judge. That day, of course, will give to me on that day. That's the judgment day. And those who have loved his appearing are the same ones like Paul that have fought the good fight, finished the race, kept the faith. They've kept their commitment. They've loved his appearing. Commitment, dedication, service. Let me read to you what Earl says in his word study of the New Testament about this whole passage. I think this is a good summary. So bear with me here. He's talking about this Greek word fight. And he says, for the first clause, almost all translations have, quote, I have fought the good fight. But in the Greek, the verb is agonizo, and the noun is agon, from which we get agonize and agony. These words came from the verb ago, which means lead, and agon was a gathering. But since the largest gatherings then as now were for athletic contest, it came to be used for the contest itself. So Paul's meaning here is probably, I have competed well in the great contest of life. The climax of all the contests of that day was the marathon race, 26 miles. The winner of this was given the highest honors. He was greeted as a great hero. He had agonized and won the agona. This fits in perfectly with the second clause, I have finished my course. The Greek word for course is dromon, which comes from the verb meaning to run. So it definitely refers to a race course. Some translations have it, I have run the great race. I have completed the course. The third clause, I have kept the faith, could possibly mean I have kept the rules. I have not been disqualified. It may well be that Paul, who was especially fond of athletic metaphors, thus intended that all three of these clauses be taken as referring to the Christian life as a long-distance race, similar to what he did in Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. Verse 8 also fits into this pattern. The crown which Paul knew was awaiting him was not the royal diadem, Greek diadema, but the victor's wreath, Stephanos. It would be given him by the Lord, who is the righteous judge or umpire. He stands at the end of each Christian's race, waiting to give him the victor's crown and welcome him into his eternal home. I think that's probably a pretty good description of what Paul's trying to say here. I've competed, and I've competed hard. I've competed according to the rules, and when I get to the end of this race, Christ will be standing there with a Stephanos for me. That victor's crown that all the Greek, those that competed in the Olympic Games of that time, that's what they were wanting. Was that garland of leaves to put on their head and be hailed as a hero. It's a pretty great word picture for Paul as he describes his death and the end of his life. Any questions or comments? Yeah.
Verse 6 and 7, I think you mentioned it, but then they tie in to the last part of verse 5. He's given a fruit of his ministry within those two verses, right?
Now run that by me again. Verse 5.
Verse 5, where it says, make full fruit of thy ministry.
Okay.
Well, Paul is doing that in verse 6.
Yeah, if you use that word proof, now that's not...
Evidence.
Yeah, and I don't know that... what is that, the King James?
Yeah.
I don't know of any other translations that have it just exactly that way. I think most of them say fulfill your ministry. The Greek word there indicates to... He's telling Timothy to complete what he started, you know, to totally complete his work. And so, but yeah, I guess in that sense, you could say he is, but I don't really know that he gave a lot of proof there. I was looking for it. I had the American Standard. I don't know what I did with it. Somebody's got a different, I'm reading the New King James says, fulfill your ministry. Who else has got something different? Who's got the American Standard, or New American Standard, ESV, what does it say?
American Standard says the same thing.
Says what? Fulfill. Yeah, fulfill your ministry. So I think it's probably the better translation there.
Complete.
English Standard says proof of thy ministry.
Okay, and that one says proof of that ministry. So, but of course that, and you may be right there. Of course he's given, and maybe he's saying to Timothy, look, and he is, let's face it, this whole book is about what? I mean, what is he doing here? He's writing to Timothy to do what? Yeah, to encourage him in his work. And so you may be right. He's saying, look, you need to fulfill yours just as what? Well, I've done mine. See, I've finished the course. I've run the race. I've agonized. I've worked hard. I've suffered hardship, and now I'm getting ready to leave here and get the victor's crown. And you're going to be by yourself, by the way. Your mentor is leaving. And, you know, you need to be ready. And you need to finish what you started. Well, the next section, verses 9 through 13, is a sad section, actually. Here he is getting ready to die, and he's got some people that haven't been there for him. He says, "Be diligent to come to me quickly, for Demas has forsaken me, having loved this present world, and has departed for Thessalonica, Crescens for Galatia, Titus for Dalmatia. Only Luke is with me. Get Mark and bring him with you, for he is useful to me for ministry. And Tychicus I have sent to Ephesus. Bring the cloak that I left with Carpus at Troas when you come, and the books, especially the parchments." Give diligence, be diligent, obviously underscores some urgency to his request. I mean, you know, he doesn't know when his execution's coming. So if anybody's going to make a trip across the Roman Empire to see him, they better get on it in a hurry before he goes. And then we'll read some of these sad circumstances we find him in next week.